Hello, I'm Mr. Wilson, and this is part 3 in the video series Introduction to Ethical Hacking. In the first video, we learned that you should never put username and password information directly into your HTML or JavaScript because that can easily be accessed using the Inspect Element tool inside of the browser. In part 2, we learned that you can use a server-side scripting language like PHP to hide code from the end user. The way this works is that you author the code, put it on the server, and that PHP code will compile a page, and the end user will only see what that code outputs. It won't see any of the behind-the-scenes action. But we still learned that it's not a good idea to put sensitive information like usernames and passwords even in a server-side code because that requires a programmer to actually update that information every time a user wants to create a new account. That's inefficient, and it still exposes that sensitive information to the programmers within our company, which is something we don't want to do. So in this episode, we're going to learn how to set up a database which we will use to store sensitive information. This is the proper way to do this because it allows a user to use a simple online form to create a new account. Anything they type in themselves gets added to the database in real time. None of our programmers have to go in and update that information. We can even set up the database in a way so that username and password information is encrypted so that even employees within our company won't be able to access that information. In this episode, I won't be demonstrating any hacking procedures. The purpose of this episode is to introduce you to SQL databases and set one up. In the next episode, I'll show you how to use code injection to hack that database and still gain entry and do other nefarious things. Then we'll learn how to insulate our database from those types of code injection hacks. The first thing we need to do is actually understand what a database is exactly. So here I'm going to use Microsoft Excel. It's just a simple spreadsheet program to demonstrate what a database does. Here you can see I've built a table that has a space for username, password, first name, last name, and user ID. So the user can enter their username into an online form, just like the one we created in the last episode. They type in their username and their password, they hit the submit button, and now that information that they type in will be added to the database. So when they fill out our form, they might type something like this. They fill in their first name, their last name, their username, and their password, and all of that information gets added to the database automatically. Now there's another column here called the user ID. This is going to be a number that the database assigns to that user, and it will do so automatically. Now this is an auto-incrementing field, which means the first one in our database will be number 1. The second one will be number 2. The user doesn't have to supply this information. It happens automatically every time a new record is added. So after a while, a couple of users come to our website and create accounts, and we can see that our database is starting to get filled up. Now all of this is happening in real time every time a new user creates an account. This saves our programmers the time of having to do any of that manual entering. Once information is in the database, we can do all sorts of things with it. When a user comes in to log into the website later on, they'll type in their username and the password into a form, and then they'll hit the little submit button. We'll write code that will say, hey, I want to look through all of the records in the database and see if any of the records have a particular username and password. If I find a record that has the username and password, I'll know who that user is, and I even know the user ID that's associated with that person. If I find a matching record, I know they're a valid user, and I can go ahead and let them into the website. So our first step is to create a database and create this table which will store our username and password information. For this, we'll be using 000 Web Host, which is a free web hosting service. The first thing we need to do is open up the Database Manager. We're going to go to Tools and down to Database Manager. Since this is the first database that we'll be creating, you can see that there's nothing in here yet. So I'm going to click the New Database button and give my database a name. I also need to supply a username and password for the database administrator. This is not the username and password that our users will be creating when they sign up for our website. This is a username and password that we, as the developer, will use to access the database, make changes to it, update information, and that sort of stuff. So this one is a secret thing that only we as the programmers are going to know. The password requirements are quite stringent. You have to include 12 characters, an uppercase and lowercase letter, and a special character. So I'm going to use capital A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, exclamation point. Now it's important that you record this information because we'll be using it later in our code. Okay, now that our database has been created, we're going to click on this button that says Manage, and we're going to come down to phpMyAdmin. The database that we're using is called an SQL database. That stands for Structured Query Language. It is its own programming language, and the early ones used an entirely console-based interface. What we're looking at here is a graphical user interface, which is great for beginners. It allows us to graphically see what the database is doing, and it will even create commands for us, and we don't have to know a whole lot about the language itself to be able to make those things happen. The first thing we have to do with this is create that table for our username and password information. So if I go back to our little Excel spreadsheet, this is what we want to build, is a table that has a column for username, password, first name, last name, and this user ID column. To create a table in our database, we're going to click on the database name itself here on the left-hand side. And here you can see that since there are no tables in our database, since it's brand new, we have to create this thing. I'm going to say that the name of my table is going to be users. And it says how many columns is our table going to have? Well, let's see. Username is the first one. Password is the second one. 3, 4, 5 columns. 5. And now I'm going to hit the Go button here. All right, so what I need to do here is tell the computer what the name of each one of those 5 columns is. The first column is called username. The next column is called password. The next column is asking us what is the type of information we're going to put in each of those fields. Well, here you can see that my username is going to store text. My password is going to store text. The first name and last name is going to store text. The only one that's really different is this user ID column, which is going to store numbers. So let's go ahead and tell the computer that the username is going to store text. There is a text option here, but I'm going to use this option that says varchar for a variable length character array. I'm going to do that for each one of these, varchar. And the last one, user ID, that is going to store numbers, so I'm going to leave that set to int. The next column is asking how many characters should the database allocate for that field. So here I'm going to tell the computer that your username cannot be any larger than 10 characters. Your password can't be any larger than 10 characters. Your first name has to max out at 15 characters, and your last name will also max out at 15 characters. At this point, this is all pretty good. There is one other thing I want to talk about here is this little column that says AI. That stands for auto increment. And since the user ID field is going to be a number that automatically counts every time a record is added, we want to check that box. Now, a box will appear and it's going to ask us, do we want to make this the primary key? Now, what a primary key is it's a unique field that the computer will use as an index. So what does that mean exactly? You can imagine that this username table is going to have a lot of records in it. If our website turns out to be a popular site, we could have thousands of users. Some websites out there have millions of users. That's a lot of data to sort through. So when a user comes in and says, I want to log into the site, they type in their username and their password, we're going to have to query that table and see if we have a matching record that matches the username and password that they typed in. that's a lot of records to go through, so it could take the computer quite a while. And if we have hundreds of users doing this all simultaneously, that could be a significant load on the computer's resources. So by indexing specific columns and making certain columns unique, that allows the computer to do this process, this searching process, we call it a query. It allows the computer to query the database a little bit faster. Now it's important that this field is unique because let's say that I have two users with the same name, let's say Bob Smith. Maybe have two Bob Smiths. How can I tell which Bob Smith is the one that's logging in? As long as I'm sure that at least one column in the table is unique, in this case our primary key, then I can differentiate between those two users. So here I'll go ahead and press the Go button, and the computer will flag this field, the user ID field, as the primary key for this database. I've got the storage engine set to InnoDB, and I'm going to hit the Save button. The computer is going to build this table. Now right now there is no information in the table, just the column names at the top. So what I want to do first is manually add one or two records in here just so you can see what the database or what the table looks like once it's been populated. So here you can see the table has been created. It is currently empty. There's no information in there. So what we're going to do is hit this little button at the top that says Insert. I want to insert a new row. All right, so the first thing is, what is the value of the username? Maybe this will be Bob23. His password will be Bob exclamation point 345. His first name, Bob, last name, Smith. And I'll leave the user ID blank because the computer will assign that automatically. I'm going to hit the Go button to add this record. Here you can see what the computer has done is it has taken the information that I've typed into those boxes and it has assembled a line of SQL code for me. So even without knowing any SQL coding language at all, just by filling in the graphical tidbits, the computer has built the line of code for me. Here's how we read this. I am going to insert into the table called users. I have to specify what column I want to insert into. In this case, I want to insert into the username column. I want to insert the following value, Bob23. That's the username. In the password column, I'm going to insert the value Bob S exclamation point 345. The last name, first name and last name boxes are going to get Bob and Smith, and I didn't insert anything for the user ID box because it will be populated automatically. So the computer built this line of code for me. It ran that line of code, and you can see that one row was successfully entered. If I want to see this information in my table, I can simply click on the Browse button. Here you can see there is one row of information in my table. I'm going to insert one more. My username, my password, first name, last name. Leave the username box blank, or user ID box blank, and hit the Go button. Here you can see one more time the computer has built an SQL command with the values that I specified. It has successfully inserted that row. To see it, I simply click on the Browse button, and you can see that now my table has two rows of information. Now it's important to note that the usernames and passwords in this table are being stored in plain text. Again, like I mentioned before, this is not something that you want to do. Ideally, you would want to encrypt that information. However, because this is our first project, I want to keep things as simple as possible. And by storing username and password in plain text, it'll be a little bit easier for you to see what is happening in the database. So for right now, I'm not going to bother with the encryption layer. Here you can see the user ID for the first record was assigned the number 1, and the second record was assigned the number 2. Now, I could go on and add as many of these as I want, but what I really want to do is create a web page that will allow users to add themselves to the database. We certainly don't want to give users access to the PHP My Admin page. That would allow them to be able to do anything to the database they want, and that would be a very bad idea. So we're going to create a web page that simply has a box for a username, password, first name, last name. They'll type it in, they'll hit submit, and they will add themselves to the database. To do this, we're going to go back to our main menu, and we're going to go to the File Manager tab here on the left. And we'll click on the Upload Files button. All right, remember that all of our public-facing files are all in the public HTML folder, so we're going to go in there first. And we can see the two files that we created last time, an index page and a handler page. We created these in the previous video. For this one, we're going to create a new document called register.php, and that one is going to have those little boxes where the user will be able to create their account. To create a new file, we click on the New File button and give it a name. Register.php. I'm going to double click it to open it. Start with all the basic stuff, an HTML tag, a body tag, and we'll put in a head up here at the top as well, just in case we want to add some stuff later on. All right, so for the body of my code, the primary thing that this is going to do is it's going to have boxes that the user will be able to type their username and password into. So let's go ahead and create a form for that. Here's my form. Now, we already talked about how forms work and how input boxes work, so I won't waste your time with that. We're just going to very quickly type that information in here. Enter the following data. Enter your username. Here's an input box. The type, text. Here's the name, uname. Here's a field for password. The password is also an input box, but this type is a password, and its name is going to be called pword. I have another input box that will store text. For the first name, its name will be fname, and then I have the same thing for my last name box right here. The last thing I need to do is create a button that the user will use to submit this information. So there's my submit button. Okay, so the question now is, when I hit the submit button, where is this information going to go? I'm going to create another file called registerhandler.php, and I want to send this information to that page. So we learned in the last video, to do that, we have to set a special action attribute and tell the computer what the name of the file is where we will be submitting this information. registerhandler.php. All right, so now we have to create this file called registerhandler.php. I'm going to save and close this, and let's create that new file called registerhandler.php. And we'll double click on this to open its code. This is going to be a PHP file, so I'll go ahead and put in my opening PHP tag, and before I forget, I'll go ahead and close that PHP tag as well. Now, the first thing that this is going to need to do is we are going to be taking that information the user put in those boxes, and we're going to be sending it to the table that we put in our database. That means that this page is going to need access to that database table. So when we first created the database, we typed in a special username and password, and I told you to save that information because we'd need it later. Well, now is that time. I have to tell this page what the username and password is that it will need to be able to access that database. So I'm going to create a variable here. Remember, PHP variable names have to start with a $, and I'm going to tell it what the domain is. Ours was called localhost. And we put a semicolon. I need another variable. This is going to be the username. What is the username? If you don't remember, you can look it up. In fact, we're going to look it up because I noticed that the computer did something kind of weird here. If I go back to my file manager and go back to the database manager tab, I can see that the username, I told it to be called my user, but it actually added this extra little bit here. So I'm going to copy the whole thing and go back to my code and paste that directly into there. Username. I'm going to create one for password. Password equals. Now I told you to write that down someplace, so I did. I created a little notepad file here and wrote that down. I'm going to go ahead and paste my password into there. I also need to tell the computer what is the name of the database itself. If you don't know, you can look it up the same way we did before. So if I go back to the database manager on my main menu, here's my DB name. I told it to just be called my database, but once again, they did add some extra stuff on there. So I'm going to copy that and paste it right into my code right there. So I have the domain, the username, the password, the database name, and the last thing I need to do is tell the computer to take that information and establish a connection to the database with it. So here I'm going to create another variable called con. You can call this anything you want. I call it con, short for connection. Connection is going to equal. Now there is a special PHP command that we can use to establish a connection to a database, and it looks like this. My SQLi connect, and in parentheses we have to pass it all of the information that it requires. It needs to know the domain, the username, the password, and the database name. If I tell it all of that information, this connect command will connect to the database and store that connection in this variable for future use. So I'm going to pass it all of those variables. Domain, username, password, and database name. The computer will make the connection and store the connection in the con variable. So what we're going to do is check to see if that connection was successful. If it was, the value of con will be true. So if this was successfully connected, then we're going to go on and do some stuff. Well, what if it did not connect successfully? In that case, I'm going to do something else. And what I'm going to do is just display a little message that says there was a failure. We're just going to specify that we couldn't connect to the database for some reason. Now I want to teach you a new command. Whenever you're displaying an error, you may want to tell the computer, display this error and then just stop. Don't do anything else after this. If I use just the regular echo command, it will just display the information, but then it will go on to continue to run more code. If I want it to display the message and then stop doing anything else, I can use the command die. So I'm going to tell the computer to die on this line, display the message and then stop doing anything else. So what if my connection was successful? What am I going to do in that case? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the username and the password and the first name and the last name, all the information that the user typed in those boxes. I'm going to take that information and build an SQL command just like the PHP MyAdmin page did when we manually added our users to the database. We're going to build that SQL command and then run that. So the first thing I need to do is retrieve the information that the user typed into those boxes. And I'm going to store it in a variable for easier access, uname. My variable is called uname. Here's how I'm going to access this information. I'm going to go to the post array. We talked about the post array in the previous video, so you can look at that if you need additional information about it. But do recall that the post array has stored all of the information that went into all of those boxes. If we save this and go back to the register page, we can see this is where those names are coming in. The username was typed into a text box called uname. The password was typed into a input box called pword. So let's go back to that register handler and continue writing that code. So here in the post array, I'm going to find that box that was called uname, and I'm going to store it inside of a variable called uname. I'm going to do the same thing for pword. I'm going to go to the post array and access the pword just like that. I want to do that for the other two boxes as well. All right, now that I have collected the username, password, first name, and last name from those boxes that the user typed them into and stored them into variables, now I'm going to build an SQL command with that information so that I can actually submit it to the database. So one more time, I'm going to create a variable called SQL Command. And this is what my command is going to be. Insert into, now what we're typing here, this is SQL, so it's a different programming language. And if you recall, when we had added these first two records to the phpMyAdmin page, it built the SQL command up here for us. So even if you don't really know SQL, you can use the phpMyAdmin, add a couple of records manually, and you'll see the line of code that it's creating. Then you can just go in and reverse engineer it and tweak it for your needs. So here I'm going to insert into, and then I have to specify the name of the table, the users table. Insert into users, and then I put in some parentheses, and here the name of the columns is going to come next. So if I take out my little Excel spreadsheet just to remind me, the username column was called username. And what am I going to type in there? What values am I going to store in the username field? In this case, I'm going to store the username. Now, the SQL does require that username, all that text that they're typing into, since they aren't SQL commands, they have to be in quotation marks, and specifically single quotes. So I'm going to put single quotes in there and then a comma. Now that was the username box. So what is the next one? Comma. The next one is the password box. And what's going to go in that? That is going to be, once again, in single quotes, the pword. And I'm just going to continue doing this for all of them. Username, password, first name, last name. And I'm storing the uname, the pword, the fname, and the lname in there. Now, just like with most programming languages, when you're done typing an SQL command, you have to terminate it with a semicolon. So here's the semicolon. And then also, because I opened a quotation mark here, I have to close that quotation mark. Now, this is all SQL, but it's all being typed in as part of a larger PHP command. So I'm taking this SQL command and storing it inside of a PHP variable. Well, all lines of PHP also need to terminate in a semicolon, so I have to put another semicolon here. So this one closes the SQL command, and this one closes the PHP command. Now that I have built that command, it's time to actually run it. So to run a command, we use a special PHP code here. We're going to say, hey, what is the result of this command that we are running? Any SQL command is actually called a query. So this is called query. And all we have to do is supply it with the name of the connection and then also the command we want to run. Remember to save this frequently. This thing loves to log you out without telling you. So now that we have created our SQL command and run it and retrieved the result, we're going to ask the computer, what was the result? Was it successful? Was I able to add the information to the table, or what did it fail for some reason? So I'm going to put in an if command here and say, what was the result? If the result was successful, then the value of result will be true. So if this was true, we're going to do one thing, but what if it wasn't successful? In that case, we're going to do something else. So if this does fail, what I'm going to do is just echo out a little message to let me know that it didn't work. Now, this is an odd error to display. The SQL command didn't run successfully. Most users won't even know what that means. So this very much is for ourselves, because remember, there are two potential errors here. The SQL command itself could fail, but I could also not even establish a connection to the database in the first place. So if one of those two things happens, I, as the programmer, need to know what is causing the problem. So a just general error message wouldn't give me any information to go off of. So later on, after I'm done testing this, I can go in and make those errors sound a little bit more user-friendly. Now you may ask, why don't I use the die command here? The answer is that if I get to this point, then I know for sure that a connection has been established. That's the only way that I can get in to see this error message, is if a connection has been established first. Now, it is important that every connection that we open, we also take the time to close. Most databases will only allow us to have so many open connections at once. So our goal here is to make the connection, do what we need to do with it as quickly as possible, and then close that connection right away so that as many users as possible can use the database all at the same time. So here, since I know that I have opened a connection, I need to take the time to close that connection. And if I use the die command, that would prevent me from adding a line of code here to close the connection. So to close the connection, we do this. We simply use the close command and tell it what connection we want to close. Now, we've established what's going to happen if the result fails. I'll display the message and then close the connection. But what if the result is successful? In that case, I'm going to display a different message, just like that. Now, once again, if the registration was successful, then the computer will still close the connection. So whether it passes or fails, the connection will close either way. So now that we're done with this, let's go ahead and test it out and see if it works. Now, the page that I want to run is this one, the register PHP page. So I'm going to go back to my main menu, and I'm going to click on View Site. This is not my registration page. This is the index.html page. So in order to see something else other than the index page, I need to manually type in the name of the file that I want to see, register.php. So up here where my address is, I'm just going to put an / and type in the file name, register.php. All right, this opens up my registration page, and I'll go ahead and fill out the information. My password is going to be ABC123, and my first name and last name. All right here I've got several PHP errors. Let's go ahead and take a look at what these are. It says that in the file register handler PHP line 11, there was an undefined index named uname. I also have an unidentified index for p-word, fname, and lname. So if I go into the register handler page and look at that, on those lines 11, 12, 13, and 14, here are my uname, p-word, fname, and lname, and it says that it can't find those indexes in the post array. So this is strange. This is something that actually happened in the register page, not the register handler. So let's go over there, and perhaps we've named these wrong or something. Let's go ahead and check. In the register PHP page, we can see that the names are in fact uname, pword, fname, and lname. So here's what is going on. I told the form to send this information to the register handler PHP, but I neglected to tell it what method to use. So in the last video, we talked about two different methods, post and get. We really only covered post, and that's what I want to do here, is tell the computer that the method for this is going to be post. Now when I save that, now it should successfully send the information to the handler properly. So let's go ahead and go back to our register page. I'm going to hit the back button here, and I'm going to hit the refresh button because I did change the register PHP page. So I want to refresh to make sure I'm looking at the most up-to-date version. And we're just going to type in our stuff one more time and hit submit. Okay, so the PHP errors have now gone away now that it knows that I'm using post as my transmission method. But I do have a new error. It says the registration failed. The SQL command didn't run successfully. So let's go back to our register handler and see if we can figure out what's going on here. So this is the error message that we're seeing. The SQL command didn't run successfully. So there's something wrong with our command. The computer built it and it tried to run it, but it failed. Now this can be a tricky thing to track down, but it's a very common thing to run into. So I want to show you the troubleshooting procedure for tracking down an error in your SQL command. Here, the SQL command is a mixture of both SQL and it has some PHP stuff like these variable names tossed in here as well. So since this is a mixture of different languages, PHP and SQL, it can be particularly difficult to track these down. So what I like to do is temporarily add a little command in here to tell me what is the SQL command that you built. Once I see it without all of this PHP stuff in there and weird quotation marks and all this other stuff, it may jump out at me as to what the problem is. If it doesn't, there's another trick I can use. So let's start by outputting what this problem is. It's telling me that the command didn't run successfully. So let's echo out what was the command that didn't run successfully. If I echo out the SQL command, then I'll be able to see what the command was, and maybe the problem will present itself. This is something that you absolutely would not want to leave in your finished page. This SQL command is going to output the names of my columns. You do not want to give your client-side users any more information about the database than they could possibly need. They could use information about your database against you to hack your database. So I don't want them to know that my column is called username or that my password column is called password. I don't want them to know how I've capitalized the F and the N in first name. I don't want them to have this information. So right now, this command is going to echo out the name of my table and all of my column names. That is a big security issue. So once I'm done troubleshooting this problem, I want to make sure that I remove this line of code from here. So let's go ahead and test that out. I'm going to go back to my page, resubmit this one more time, ABC123, and submit. Registration failed. It did not complete successfully. Here is the command that it's attempting to run. Insert into sandbox.users, the username, password, first name, last name. All of this at first glance appears to be okay. All of my non-code stuff is inside of the single quotation marks. Username, password, all these column names all match the names of their respective columns. The capitalization is all correct and all of that. So what exactly is causing the problem? It's not jumping out at me, so I've got one more trick for you. What I'm going to do is copy this SQL command that I've written. Control-C is the speed key for copy. I'm going to go back to phpMyAdmin, and there's an SQL tab here that will allow me to type in my own SQL commands and run them. The nice thing about this is that if an error occurs, it will give me a little bit more information about what the error is. So here I'm going to take out this and paste in the line of code that my page has assembled, and I'm going to tell it to go. Here I should get the same error that I had before. It's not going to be able to run this command because there's something wrong with it. But I get a little bit more information this time. Look at this. Insert command denied to this user for table users. And here, so I'm seeing that there's something wrong. It's either a problem with the username and password that I've created for the table, for the database itself. I know that's not the problem. Here's the reason I know that. In order for me to get down to this part, I have to have a successful connection. I know that I have successfully connected to the database, so the username and password that I'm using to connect to the database must be okay. So that's not the problem. What could it be then? It says that it's having a problem accessing the table itself, the table called users. So this draws my attention to the table name, users, with a lowercase u, but when I look here, I see that the table is actually spelled with a capital U. That is the problem that I'm having. So what I'm going to do is go back to my code. I'm going to go back to the table name, and I'm going to change that lowercase u to a capital U and save that. Let's go back and try our page one more time. Hit the submit button. Registration failed. The SQL command didn't run successfully. Here you can see I am capitalizing the user's name here. What is this sandbox? That was a typo from something that I did not intend to put in there. I have nothing called sandbox. The table is just called users. So let's go ahead and save that and try one more time. ABC, 1, 2, 3. There we go. All right, now that I have successfully called the table by its proper name, users with a capital U, no sandbox reference there, then it is now successfully running, and you can see my registration was successful. I advise you to go back into phpMyAdmin and check your table when you're testing to ensure that the record was actually added. It says it was, but let's just double check. I'm going to go back into phpMyAdmin and hit the browse button. This will show me the first two records that I added, this one and that one. And look, there's my brand new third record added to the table as well. All right, so what's nice about this is that I now have a registration page that users can use to sign up for accounts, and the information they type into these boxes will be added to the database. They can add themselves to the database without any of our programmers having to get involved. What's also nice about this is later on I can go ahead and add extra stuff to encrypt the username and password information in my database so that even programmers within our own company won't be able to access the sensitive user credential information. That is the ideal way to handle registrations, passwords, usernames, and that sort of stuff. Now, right now, this page is quite ugly, but I can dress it up with all manner of CSS and graphics and everything so that it looks like a real website. And I can even dress up the registration handler page as well so that those little messages that are either giving me errors or little messages that are telling me the registration was successful, I can dress that up and make that pretty as well. But there is one thing that I need to make sure that I do. This little command that I added, which is going to display my SQL command in the event of a failure, needs to be removed. So I'm going to go ahead and backspace that out, hit save, and now if the registration fails again in the future, our end users won't be seeing sensitive information about our database. Remember, even though we have hard-coded this into the code, this is server-side code. So even if I use the inspection tool, the end user will not be able to see my SQL command, and therefore they won't know any of my table names or any of my column names or anything else about the database itself. It's all secured with server-side programming.